Welcome along to this session around getting started with the Microsoft Graph. My name is Robert Crane and thank you very much for joining me. Now, before we kick off and get into the main part of this presentation, what I'd like to do is just show you one of the major reasons or one of the major benefits of the Microsoft Graph. So if you're based here in Australia, you will probably have heard of the Essential 8. It is a framework to help you protect devices in your environment. Now what I can do here is basically run a script. You'll see here that that is one that I've created, and what that is going to do is it's going to go out and create the appropriate device policies in Endpoint Manager to align with the Essential 8. So you'll see how quickly that was done. So if I pop across here, I'm in Endpoint Manager, you'll see there are no policies here prior to that script running, but if I do go in here and refresh that, what I should see are all the policies that were just added. So that's the real power here of the Microsoft Graph, is the ability to basically go in and automate a huge amount of capability. And we'll talk about the real benefits of the graph and why that does make things easier to automate. Now, if we go and have a look at what Microsoft tells us the graph is, it says that it is a gateway to data intelligence in Microsoft 365, and it provides a unified programmability model, all right, and the idea is it's going to give you access to lots of data. Now, if we go in and have a look at the diagram Microsoft also provides us with, again, it can be a bit confusing. There's a lot of stuff here, but the major takeaway I would suggest is simply that the graph is going to allow you to access a huge amount of information. So think of it like a very large database with access to just about everything in Azure and Microsoft 365. So things like email, SharePoint, and you'll see here it also extends to the ability to create bots and work with different portals and conversations in Teams and so on. So at its essence, just think of the graph as a very large database with lots and lots of data from interactions and capabilities within your Microsoft 365 environment. Now, what's the benefit of spending some time with the Microsoft Graph? Well, it has a single endpoint. So what that means is you make requests via a simple URL, which is graph.microsoft.com. You'll also notice that that request is HTTP, right? So it's doing it via a web request rather than a traditional PowerShell approach. The other advantage here is it works with a variety of technologies. They can be PowerShell, which is going to be the large focus of this presentation, but it will also work with things like Power Automate. So once you've worked out the capability or what you want to achieve with the graph, then you can go and use Power Automate as well. And of course, if you want to get more into the coding side of it, you can also use it with .NET. It also has granular data consent. So that means that you're able to go down and set permissions at a very low level for individual items or individual access. One of the challenges with a traditional approach in things like PowerShell is once you have access or connected using the traditional module, then what happens is you have typically the full rights through that area. So the graph is going to give us that granularity if we want to go there. Now, the other thing that I will point out here is that it is the preferred way that Microsoft wants you to work with Microsoft 365 when it comes to automation and scripting. So the move away from the traditional approach to typically PowerShell individual modules from each team to a unified model here that will work across all environments. Now, if you aren't familiar with the traditional way of using PowerShell, what we need to typically do is to install the appropriate modules for Exchange, SharePoint, and so on. Then we need to go and connect to each of those individually. Now, if you want to connect to a range of services at one time, that can be very challenging because you have to connect to each one individually, which requires unique login and potentially MFA access. So we can improve that by using the graph. But before we do that, let's just have a look at how traditionally it has worked here. So let's jump back to our demo machine here, and let's just minimize that one and go to the next option here. So typically the way that we connect to our Microsoft 365 environment has been to go through the ability here to go in and connect to Exchange Online. So I'm going to connect to the user here. I'm already connected to that environment. And you'll see that it will go and connect to Exchange Online, and now it is connected. So now once that is connected, I can now go and run a standard PowerShell command. In this case, I'm running a script that goes through basically all the mailboxes looking for forwards in the environment. All right, so the reality here is that we would have to repeat that process if we wanted to do anything associated with SharePoint Online or the compliance module or whatever. So we'd have to go through and basically repeat that each time we wanted to connect to an individual service. Now, as mentioned, the ability here is that the Microsoft Graph has a single endpoint. So we can just go to graph.microsoft.com, and in this case, you'll see that you can connect to a number of different endpoints. So the endpoint, typically the current production endpoint, is /v1.0, and then the command follows after it. So this is a typical graph command. All right, so we go graph.microsoft.com / the version that we're after, typically version 1.0, and then the command, in this case just me, after that. That will return information about the login, the current login. Now, the first way we can start looking at the graph is to use something called the Graph Explorer. So the Graph Explorer, you'll find at aka.ms/ge, and it's a web interface into the capabilities around the Microsoft Graph, allowing you to run basically different commands without the need to go down to a scripting level. It's very good for testing the environment and finding out. So why don't we pop in there and just basically have a look at that. So again, let's go into our demo 2 here, and you'll see that we can run all this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start that Graph Explorer here. All right, so let me start that over here. And you'll see that that pops up here, and this is the commands up the top here. I can run a get, a post, a put, a patch. So this is the way that we work with HTTP requests. You'll see here is the versions that we've got at the moment. There is V1 of the graph or the beta. You can work with either, and you'll see here that this is the command. So what I'm going to do here is push this command, and you'll see that it will go off and run that in the interface, and it will return information down the bottom here for us. Now that information is displayed in what's called JSON format, right? So think of it a bit like XML. It's a standardized format that will give you that information that you're after. Now, over on the right-hand side here, you'll see that we have a number of inbuilt queries. You can also go in and run your own here. So let's go in and have a look at the security one. Roll down here a bit, and you'll see there's an option here to get the secure score, right? So if I double-click on that, you'll see here is the command, the graph command, to go and access secure score for this tenant. So I'm going to run this query here. All right, now you'll notice that in this case I've got an option here that says I'm forbidden. So this is an example of the granular permissions that are being set or maintained by the graph. Now with the interface here, the first thing to do to make sure is that you're logged in. So if you go into the top right hand corner, make sure that you are logged into the Graph Explorer so that you do have the appropriate permissions. If you are still unable to do that, you may need to go and set those permissions as mentioned. And the idea here, you can do it in the interface by selecting the modified permissions here, right? So you'll see here that we basically, pull this down a bit, you'll see here that to have that graph command run successfully, what I need to do is I need to have these appropriate permissions, right? So I would have to go in and consent, those permissions to be allowed to run that, that graph request there. All right. So that's an example of the granularity. Also an example of the Graph Explorer. That's probably the best way to get started with the graph. Do it in the interface here in the browser, so you do get a feel for it. Use the sample queries and get a feel for the environment before you start diving into it and using it with code. So we mentioned the permissions there. Now the permissions are key to allowing access to the graph information, and you'll find those permissions typically in Azure AD. So you'll be able to go in there and view them and have a look. So why don't we again pop over and just have a look at those permissions. So once again, let's go to our area here, and we can bring that up using again PowerShell. So we can run that. So this is going to take us to our Azure AD location. It's going to take us to an area called Enterprise Applications. All right, so if we look in our Azure AD, you'll find an option there for enterprise applications. Here are all the applications that are basically using the graph in our environment. Now, the one in this case, the Graph Explorer, you'll see is mentioned here. So here's our Graph Explorer application. All right, so let's click on that, dive in there, and that's going to give us information about the application there. But you'll find down here that there is the option under security for permissions. Now, these are the API or the graph permissions there. Now, you'll see here that I have, the different items. So, for example, I've got user read, so I can click on that and get more information about that permission. All right, and I can also go in and grant permissions for this, and I can also review permissions if I want. Now, you'll notice here that one thing I don't get is I don't get the capability to set permissions, and we'll come to that. Because the Graph Explorer is something that's done in the web interface via, the screen that I just showed you, that's where the permissions are set. So that is not enabled in these enterprise applications, because an enterprise application is typically driven by the application, but we can go in and we can create custom applications, and we will come to that item shortly. Now, the first step, once you get away from the Graph Explorer, is going to be the Graph PowerShell SDK. Now, to get the Graph SDK working, we do need to install the module. So you'll have to go install-module -name Microsoft.graph. And then what we're going to do is we're going to connect to the graph with the scope optional parameter. That is going to control the permissions for that session when it comes to the graph. So we can go in and set the scopes and the permissions basically in our script or whatever we're running there on the command line. And then we're going to run a command like get-mg user or whatever to be able to get to all the information that we want. All right, so why don't we go in and have a look at that in our demo environment again. So let's pop across to our PowerShell and find that particular demo. Move across here, and let's open the one here. So you'll see that I've already installed the graph module. So I'm going to go in here and connect to the graph environment. So why don't I clear the screen first so you can see what's going on. So let me go in here and go to the graph. So that's going to connect to the graph. Now, the reason that it's done a direct connection is I'm already logged in as a user because I was connected to Exchange. Now, once I've done that, I've set the appropriate permissions, and what I'm going to do now is run a dedicated graph command to get all the users in my environment. All right, so then you'll go in and you'll see basically how that works. It does very, very standard stuff. But the important thing to remember is I only have to connect to the graph once, then I can go in and do commands across Exchange, SharePoint, users, security, whatever I want. So it's going to simplify that. Now, you'll notice that I also have an option here. There's another way that we can connect to the graph, another SDK module. All right, so this one's called MG Graph, very much the same. Now, the difference here is that when I'm working with MG Graph, you'll notice that I'm now beginning to work basically closer with the true HTTP requests, which form the graph. The previous ones are sort of masking that in a way. So let me go in here and set the URL. So what I want to do here is basically go in. You'll see that I'm going to the beta endpoint rather than the V1. I'm going into device management and also into the configuration policies. I'm going to run a PowerShell command here that is going to run that web request of that URI and then get the value and report it here, right? So if I select that and run that, what it should return for us is all the policies. So if you remember in the presentation, I did that Essential 8 where I set basically all the policies initially using PowerShell and a graph command there. What I'm doing now is I'm retrieving all of those settings again using the power of the graph. Now in this case, you'll notice that the commands that I used are getting closer to making those web requests. So we can still do that, all of that in PowerShell, obviously, but again, we do need to make some slight adjustments when it comes to working with those slightly different environments. You can keep it in a typical PowerShell command of mg- or get-mg user, or we can start getting into actually using the URLs that are what the graph are all about. So a better way to look at managing your permissions is probably to go in and start setting up your own permissions. You can create your own app inside. So rather than having an enterprise app running the show that's managed by another third party, you can go in and create your own application, and you can use that to work with the graph. All right, so let's go in and have a look at doing that. So once again here, let me just open this up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop over to the portal here again, the Azure portal. But this time what I'm looking at, you'll see here I'm in app registration. So on the left-hand side, we were looking at enterprise applications previously. Now we're looking at app registration. So app registrations are basically custom apps that have been created by myself in this case. So let's go and have a look. You'll see here there are a number listed here. The one that I created here called CIAOPS. So let's go and have a look at that one. That's already been pre-created. And if we go down and look at the API permissions, all right, you'll see here, this is where these are all the permissions that granular permissions that I have set for this application so that it can take advantage of them. Now, if I want to add a permission, in this case, because it's a custom application, I go in here, I could select the Microsoft Graph, I could determine whether it's delegated or application, and then here you'll see that I can go in and just tick a box and provide that permission to this application. So I'm doing the permissions by application, and you'll see that they are all granted. I can go in here, obviously, and remove that permission. I can revoke admin consent and so on. So I've got far more control over my environment if I set my own custom application or embed my own custom application into Azure AD here. So once I've done that, what I can then do with that application, I can use that application to access the information that I want. So here's a script here that I've created that we can run. And what it's going to do is it's going to go out and take advantage of that application I just showed you to return the secure score. So it's using that graph call we looked at in the Graph Explorer. It's using a HTTP request, but what you'll notice with this script, it's actually returning the result from two independent tenants here. So because I've got an app registered in each of those tenants separately, I'm able to go out and call that or access that tenant using that application with all the security that's built around that, and then come out and basically repeat that request but going to a different tenant. So this is how I can start looking at doing multi-tenant environments. The secret there is to create and embed your own app inside the environment prior to needing access to that. Now, as I mentioned, one of the other really powerful things about the graph is its ability to work across different services. So in this case, you can also get it to work with Power Automate. So let me go in and just show you how we can make all of that work with our Power Automate. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to jump into the Power Automate environment. Excuse me. All right, so take a moment for that to spin up initially. And the idea here is that this obviously makes creating automations much easier. So I've already created a flow here that's going to give me my secure score on demand. So if I go in and edit it just to show you what it's all about, that will come up. Now, what I've done here is I'm going to manually trigger it, so that's going to be something I will force in a minute. I set up a couple of variables, just set up the environment. Now, these are where the securities are involved. So what I've done is I've taken an app and I said put it embedded in each tenant, and then the credentials or security around that I've put into an Azure Key Vault. So I can now access that Azure Key Vault details directly from my Power Automate, so I can do this all in the cloud. The other benefit of putting it in the Key Vault is I can set up alerts so I know when people are accessing that Key Vault at any time. Now, the key item here that makes the graph request, you'll see here is this familiar graph request here. So again, we're going to, in this case, V1, security, secure score, and so on. So that is something we saw earlier on. And if we go down the bottom here and look at the advanced options, you'll see that I'm using those values from my Azure Key Vault to authenticate the request to the graph. So I still do need to authenticate that. Now once I've got the result, remember the result comes back in JSON in a particular format. I'm going to tidy that up and present it in a way. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw the output from that into a Microsoft Team chat message. All right, so that's going to give us some sort of output. So what I'll do is I'll go back here, and then what I will do is I will go in and I will run that. All right, so let's go in and run that flow. All right, so that is now done. We should have a good result here. So let's just look at that. You'll see that it ran very quickly. So let's go in and just double check that that all worked as expected. All right, so we get all green ticks here indicating that that has worked. We can go in and obviously look at the outputs here as well. So you'll see that we can also view the output. So there's our basically there's our JSON, which we saw before when we used the Graph Explorer. All right, so very, very similar, and that's what makes it nice and consistent for it, right? So obviously the output is going to end up in Teams, so why don't we pop across and have a look in Teams, bring that up so we can go in and view it. All right, so let's, so the idea here was, before that, these are the secrets, all right? So this is the Azure Key Vault. So you'll see this is the secrets or the credentials for the application inside each tenant. So I've put each of those inside a key vault here, which I'm then going out to access. So great way to store any sort of credentials in there. But the big advantage of the vault is I can access them programmatically, either with something like PowerShell or in this case the Power Automate. So now let us go and jump across into our team and see what the output of that Power Automate was. Give that a moment to spin itself up. So again, if we have a look in here, you'll see here it is here. So here's the result. Right, so here is the result of our Power Automate, and that has been pushed out again using basically this Power Automate, which used the graph to go and get that information. So we can do this, as I mentioned, in PowerShell. We can also do it inside Power Automate. What Power Automate gives you is this nice ability to then interface with other services in Microsoft, like Teams, email, and then go in and take additional options. It also means that you don't have to get deep into the roots when it comes to using PowerShell. So it makes it much easier for people to get involved and complete tasks without having to do a deep dive into PowerShell. All right, so some takeaways from the session for you is when it comes to automation, the graph is your friend. Certainly recommend that you think about going in there and spending some time learning the graph and the commands there, how it works. You can use the graph, as I've shown, with PowerShell via a HTTP request, and also things like Power Automate and so on, so lots of flexibility. Microsoft is investing heavily in the graph, so that's why I would certainly recommend you take the time to learn that and understand that and begin to incorporate that in any scripting that you've got. And the graph provides that single endpoint, so graph.microsoft.com, whatever the command may be. So it makes it nice and easy just to constantly hit that single endpoint rather than bouncing between different PowerShell modules, for example. It gives you that granular permission. You can set up your own application inside Azure, and you can set up low-level granular permission. So one user can only do this, another user can do that, and it gives you much more control over those single permissions. All right, and the idea here is it does permit non-interactive login. So as I've shown you there, we can run a script that bounces around or bounces through multiple tenants to give the result that is desired without having to log into every single tenant. So again, allows you to do non-interactive logins where the user doesn't put their details and so on. And working with the Microsoft Graph and PowerShell requires, a different approach. So because we're working with PowerShell, we still need to understand the modules, understand the flow of PowerShell, but we're working with a HTTP request, and we need to set up, some securities and that to allow that. But once you've got that down, it really is much easier to copy and paste and replicate and get out the automation that you want. You don't have to keep authenticating and worrying about a different set of commands. It's all contained in a HTTP request. All right, so with that, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. Hopefully you've got some value out of it. I do have some other resources out there available. Again, my blog is always the best place. GitHub for some of the scripts there that you've seen, YouTube videos, and also the podcast. And please think about the CIAOPS patron.com community, all sorts of things around the Microsoft Cloud, and reach out to me if you do have any questions, queries on any of the content here. The contact details are listed below there. So once again, thank you very much for watching this video.